I'm Sheldon McLeod, and welcome back to Thinking Out Loud here, presented to you on the SaltWire Network. And there's been a lot of conversation recently about non-disclosure agreements. In fact, there has been opposition legislation introduced in Nova Scotia, and there's been some conversation about what this all means. As a matter of course, there was a headline from my colleague John McPhee talking about the Nova Scotia government in the hot seat over non-disclosure agreements and where that's going. It had to do with a document that was tabled by Elizabeth Smith McCrossan. And to be fair, I just received note that she is involved in her own legal action. And there's been a lot of conversation, as mentioned, about, well, what the inappropriate use of NDAs will look like or result in. And to talk a little bit about that, I wanted to talk with the folks involved with a group or an agency known as You Can't Buy My Silence. And this is a campaign that's global in scope in the United Kingdom, here in Canada. And we do know that province of Prince Edward Island had passed legislation making it illegal to use a non-disclosure agreement in a case involving a sexual assault. And Dr. Julie Macfarlane is here to join the conversation. She is a professor emerita at University of Windsor and one of the co-founders of Can't Buy My Silence. Very much a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for doing this.
And you too, Sheldon.
And where did your interest in this particular issue grow out of?
Well, I originally came across the whole idea of non-disclosure agreements when I brought my own personal legal action against the Anglican Church. I was sexually abused when I was a teenager, which is many, many years ago now, Sheldon, by a church minister. And I had always felt that I needed to do something to step up and make sure that this person was not still in a position of authority and power. The Anglican Church assumed that I would sign a non-disclosure agreement. And I said, absolutely, under no circumstances. In fact, I made it part of my settlement agreement that they changed their policy and stopped requiring people to sign non-disclosure agreements. But the second thing that happened to me, which is probably the most important, is that as a university professor, I had a number of students come to me and report that one of my own colleagues was sexually harassing them and bullying them. And having spoken to a number of different people, I took this to my president, who suspended the individual, conducted an investigation, and then terminated them, which, of course, as you know, Sheldon, is a very big deal to terminate a tenured professor. And so the students felt very relieved. I felt this is a really good outcome. And then I started to get phone calls from other university law schools in other countries asking me, not because I was listed as a reference, but because my work was known to them, asking me, why did my colleague leave? How odd to just leave as a tenured professor. And the penny dropped, Sheldon, and I realized they'd given him a non-disclosure agreement. So very, very long story ensued, but the university basically hid behind the non-disclosure agreement because they were absolutely prepared to secretly pass someone who they acknowledged was a danger and was abusive towards students to another university because they had made a deal with that person. They wanted to protect their own reputation, and he wanted to protect his reputation. There were no victims involved, and hence the deal was made. And having tried unsuccessfully for the next year to persuade the University of Windsor to change its policy going forward, at least, and not do this again, and they weren't willing to agree to that, I resigned my position in disgust. And I met Zelda Perkins, who is well known as the first woman to have broken her Harvey Weinstein NDA. And we started to talk to one another at the beginning of the following year. And Can't Buy My Silence was born out of those discussions. And it was launched in September 2021, just 18 months ago, but 18 very, very busy months for myself and Zelda.
And without question, this is a topic that has been in the news here in Nova Scotia. As I referred to, the Prince Edward Island government had passed legislation, and Nova Scotia's premier has said, well, we're doing a jurisdictional scope of review. And the people who say, well, what are you looking for? There are already models of this legislation out there. From your experience and perspective, is that little more than an excuse, or is there any merit in saying we want to see what other jurisdictions are doing before we enact a law like that?
Well, I mean, it's perfectly responsible for government to say they want to see what's going on in other jurisdictions. The reason that this seems like a somewhat thin excuse is that there are a number of jurisdictional reviews already been done. One has been done by the Republic of Ireland, where we've been working, and a bill is accepted there going forward, accepted by the government. There's also the Manitoba Law Reform Commission, which has been investigating NDAs since a bill was tabled there about 4 or 5 months ago now, and their report is due any time. I've been working with people in British Columbia inside the government, helping them to look at the research as well. And our website has a complete jurisdictional review on it, plus the legislation that has been tabled in Nova Scotia, just as PEI, Manitoba, and now BC, is legislation that was drafted by us, by myself, in the campaign. So, there are many different models, which I would be delighted to talk to the Premier about, but it doesn't really ring true to me that they've spent, a year or more thinking about doing a jurisdictional review, but nothing has actually happened. And in addition, I think that the example of the Mass Casualty Commission, which of course is just reported, is very instructive here, because the Mass Casualty Commission report, which touches on a lot of things related to NDAs, was done in consultation with victims and survivors. It was done in consultation with community agencies and women's groups. And when the Minister of Justice was actually asked in a budget hearing the other day, which groups have you consulted with in order to bring forward this, to advance this review you say you're doing, he wasn't able to name a single one.
I want to know why the federal legislation might not be appropriate, or why it needs to happen at a provincial level from your perspective.
Well, employment law in Canada is principally governed by the provinces. So for most regular folks, our workplace terms and conditions are set by our provincial governments. Now, there is also an oversight of federal regulation, but that applies primarily to those people who work for the federal government and within their statutory agencies. We very much would like, and there are discussions going on at a very high level there also that I'm having with federal politicians. We would very much like the federal government, as a symbolic piece, I think, mostly, Sheldon, to say, we recognize that covering up misconduct and telling victims that they can't talk about what happened to them enables people to go on being reharmed by the same perpetrators, and it also closes down that victim's opportunity simply to talk privately to their own family and friends. So we would like the federal government to take that step, and it will certainly then mean they're not giving NDAs to their own federal employees. And we know that they do that. I have a number of examples of that. But most of what goes on for most people's work lives is provincial. And that's why we're bringing this legislation province by province.
The Canadian Bar Association has shown its support against this practice. And as you've also pointed out, this has been an ongoing conversation for some time. Where you have on your website an opportunity for people to write letters to their elected representatives. I don't know that there's that much confusion about what this issue is, but how will that help clarify what it is that Can't Buy My Silence and others who have been victims or have been forced to sign an NDA to further their goal of having this legislation passed?
Well, I do think, Sheldon, that it is very important for people to make their opinions known here. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that far, far more people than I think anybody realizes are affected by NDAs. There is now research from the United States. In fact, there are several sources with the same result that say that the estimate is that 1 in 3 employees have signed an NDA. Now, some of those NDAs are going to be NDAs for their original purpose, and what we certainly have no issue with, and none of our work or legislation is aimed at changing that, which is to protect trade secrets. If you work for an organization that has confidential, sensitive commercial information that's being developed through research and development internally, or indeed if you're handling client matters, obviously there is a need for confidentiality. But what has happened in the last probably, we estimate, around the last 10 years, is that NDAs are now being used as a default every time anybody raises any complaint in the workplace, whether that is harassment, sexual assault, discrimination, bullying, and so forth. And so, in effect, misconduct is now being treated as if it is a trade secret. And you can, I'm sure, Sheldon, see the irony of that. So I think it's important that representatives hear from people who've been directly affected by this, because there are far more of them than they realize. And I think it also does an important job in trying to explode some of the myths that are being circulated. And one of those is victims really want NDAs. These are really good for victims. And we're starting to hear this argument in Nova Scotia now as well. And this is one I've heard in many places, in many parts of the world. And this is what I think people who have not been involved with an NDA need to understand. There is nobody out there who signed an NDA who did so because they thought it was a really good idea. They did it because they were told to do it, and because they were told that if they didn't sign a non-disclosure agreement, they would not receive any compensation, and moreover, they would not receive their own privacy, which is very important to victims. So an NDA is this really noxious bargain where the victim of a perpetrator or the organization that they're negotiating on behalf of the perpetrator says, we will keep your matter private, but only if you agree to do the same for us. So it's a reciprocal. Now, there's no way that contract law really works like that. Of course, the victim could say, I just need my privacy protected. I don't want to have to promise to protect the other side. But this is the bargain that's being made in NDAs. And I think that it's very unfortunate that some of the people saying, oh, but victims really want this, haven't read the testimonials on our website. They haven't talked to people, because people are scared of talking about this, who have signed NDAs, and they're not really coming from a grassroots victim's perspective. In our campaign, we talk to dozens and dozens of people every week who've signed NDAs, and we have their stories on the website. And there isn't a single victim out there who is going to say, this was my choice. It was something they were required to do.
Throughout the Jean Ghomeshi trial, we heard a lot about criminal justice and we heard about civil liability. And this is it seems exclusive to the business world, the corporate world, the educational institutions. And we know that the criminal justice system does not allow the name of a victim to be published or broadcast. So how does that play into what we're discussing here today about why the rules, the laws, and the instruments available need to be tuned for that scenario?
Right. Well, that's a really good question, Sheldon. And I think this does make this, difficult for people necessarily to understand. So most of the issues that are being covered up in NDAs, not all of them, think back to Hockey Canada, for example, but most of the issues being covered up in NDAs do not rise to the level of criminality. So, for example, sexual harassment is usually a civil, not a criminal matter. And so we certainly do see criminal matters being closed off using non-disclosure agreements, or potentially criminal matters, as we did in the Hockey Canada saga, of course. But most of these are civil matters, and that means that the settlement that's being made, and again, just as context, 95% of civil legal action is settled. It's settled before a trial or a tribunal because it's just so expensive to go through trials. So that figure, 95%, that applies throughout the common law world. It's been the same for about 35 years. So, and sometimes people are surprised at that. So you've got 95% of these complaints, a workplace complaint, a civil complaint, settling. And as part of that settlement, people are being told you must agree to a non-disclosure agreement. And that means you can't speak to your family, your friends, a counselor, a therapist. Now, you can't stop someone going to the police. You can't stop somebody being a protected whistleblower. But a lot of this is proceeding on the basis of people's lack of legal knowledge. They're told, sign this, don't speak to anyone. If you speak to anyone, we will take back the compensation. And there are many, many people who now live with this kind of monkey on their back because they've been told if they give any information away about what happened to them, they might lose their compensation. And, just as a practical matter, Sheldon, this includes going for an interview for a new job. If you left that particular workplace and now you're going somewhere else for a new job, you're not even supposed to tell them that you left the last place because of harassment or whatever it might have been.
I guess Can't Buy My Silence, the website, the name of this campaign is abundantly clear. So your advice to the your advice to the Premier of Nova Scotia, to Tim Houston, what does he need to hear?
I think in some ways what needs to happen now is really pretty simple, because although there is a lot of confusing legal arguments made around NDAs, the basic principle here is simple, Sheldon, which is that people shouldn't have to promise to protect someone who has behaved badly towards them, and in some cases, worse than badly, in order that they can have a settlement and they can go on with their lives. So we're calling on the Premier to, consult all the sources that I can refer him to in a brief conversation that have already done jurisdictional reviews, consult with people, including the victims themselves in Nova Scotia, and bring forward legislation that will stop people being coerced into settlements that effectively buy their silence. That's not a moral thing to do, and it's not the way that we're going to have safer workplace and corporate culture in the future.
Anything else you'd like to add before we conclude?
I think that there are many people who will be listening to this who are thinking, yes, me too. There are so many more people out there than we realize who are living under this burden. And I really hope that shortly we will be looking back on this as a thing of the past. But it's important for Nova Scotians to express their views on this to the Premier and get them off the fence, because we can see the way that the wind is blowing in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in the United States. And Nova Scotia needs to get on board.
She is Professor Emeriti at the University of Windsor. Julie Macfarlane, Professor, thank you again.
Thank you.